Hello and welcome everybody to another exciting episode of Sci Talks 2.0. My name is Jack and today I want to share some exciting new findings in the field of autism research. In this paper that was published a few months ago, the researchers demonstrated that by changing the gut microbiome, they were able to reverse some of the symptoms of autism. This is an exciting breakthrough and could lead to immediate therapeutic options for kids with autism. So what was the main point of the paper? Well, we know that the brain and the gastrointestinal system communicate with each other in various different ways. For example, through hormonal signaling, through the nervous system directly innervating the gastrointestinal system. But now there's a third layer of sophistication that's added to that, and this is the role of the gut microbiome in affecting the brain. So if we look within the gut anatomy, what we will find is that there's billions and billions of bacterial species that live within the gastrointestinal tract. Generally, we think of bacteria as being, germs that we want to get rid of, but in fact, in this case, these bacteria are there in a symbiotic relationship that's beneficial for us, and it gives us the ability to have a healthy life. So if we look within the gut, all of this bacterial species together, this is what's called the gut microbiome. And there's, like I mentioned, billions and billions of these kinds of bacteria. Moreover, there's hundreds and thousands of different species of bacteria. So it's really important in order to have a healthy lifestyle and be healthy in general, is to have a good balance of the type and the amount of bacteria within this microbiome. And studies from other kinds of diseases have demonstrated that when the balance tips and there's certain types of bacteria that are more prevalent or the quantity decreases, it could lead to disease states. But now we're understanding that these changes in the microbiome are also affecting the brain. And studies from many, many different labs have demonstrated a crucial and profound effect of the behavior of these bacteria within our gut in terms of regulating the diseases or keeping us healthy within our lifespan. And moreover, now we're understanding that it's very important to have a healthy brain, is to have a healthy gut and a healthy microbiome. So if we look at autism for a second, we see that kids with autism demonstrate a specific types of behavior. Specifically, the two that I'm going to focus on and what the paper and the researchers focused on was that kids with autism have impaired social communication and interactions, and they have repetitive behavior. So these are the two common features that we find amongst kids with autism. So in terms of the gut microbiome and its relation to autism spectrum disorder, it had been long known that there's a connection in the sense that kids with autism generally have very profound gastrointestinal problems. Moreover, some studies had demonstrated that when we give kids antibiotics for other reasons, right? The antibiotics are generally there to kill the bacteria that the kids potentially had an infection from. What happened is that when antibiotics were administered to these kids, their symptoms improved for that brief period of time. So all of these pieces of information together suggested that the gut microbiome could have an effect on the behavior and some of the symptoms that we observe in kids with autism. But no one until this paper had been able to demonstrate the clear link, and not only that, be able to use this link to actually reverse the symptom. So let's take a look at exactly how the researchers in this paper went about in doing these. Did was they took two groups of kids. One group was kids who had autism spectrum disorder, and so they had behaviors and were clinically diagnosed to have autism. And then they took age matched, similarly matched in terms of all other parameters, kids who have typical developmental stages at this point in their lives. So in other words, as far as we know, these kids don't have any autism-like behavior. So they were essentially the control group for these experiments. So then next thing that they did was they isolated the gut microbiome from each of these two different groups of kids, right? So what they did was essentially they took the fecal matter and grind it up and isolated the bacterial content, the microbiome from these kids. Then what they did was they took this microbiome and injected into mice, right? So these mice were made in such a way that they have no microbiome within their gastrointestinal system. So it's completely cleared of any bacteria. So then when they transferred these bacteria within the mice gastrointestinal system became populated with the bacterial species that was injected into them. After doing this experiment, the first thing that they did was to see what's the population diversity and what is the quantity of bacteria within the mice gastrointestinal system. And so what they found in this first figure is that if we compare the blue oval with the red being the control group and the blue being the kids with autism, what they noticed is that the kids with autism had a much lower diversity of microbiome. In other words, the animals which received the bacterial content from the kids with autism spectrum disorder had much lower diversity of bacteria. So there were profound changes within the different population of bacteria that we generally find within the gastrointestinal system. So this suggested that there is a profound difference in the GI tract or the gastrointestinal tract. And then the next thing that they did was they said, okay, can we cluster these groups of animals that either received the control group bacteria or the autism spectrum disorder, how much do they look alike? And what they found was here, once again in red, is that all the control group mice essentially clustered together, meaning that all the mice that received bacteria from the different children of the control group all looked the same, saying that all the control group bacterias look the same, whereas the ones with the autism spectrum disorder, they all clustered within themselves, suggesting that these two groups are distinct in terms of the biodiversity or the bacterial diversity that they find. Moreover, if we look at how close they are, the ones that have autism spectrum disorder generally have similar types of bacteria. And that similarity is really different than the ones from the control group. Now, this was exciting, but this wasn't the most profound findings of the paper, because there were other studies previously suggesting that there are differences in the gut microbiome. But the question at the time was, is it a cause or effect? Meaning, is the autism causing the change in the bacterial content and the diversity, or is the bacterial diversity causing the autism? So in order to prove that it was the actual bacterial diversity change that was causing it, what they then did was, once they established that these two animals had different bacterial content, and remember, these mice are healthy animals. By all standards, they don't have any behavioral defects or any behavioral changes or any behavioral issues prior to getting the injections from the respective groups, right? So in the next set of experiments, they did psychological testing on these mice to see what their behavioral responses were when they got the gut microbiome either from the autism spectrum disorder kids or the typically developing children. Now, these results are, I think, one of the most fascinating and exciting results. So what they found is, when they did the behavioral test, is that the animals who got the microbiome from the autism spectrum disorder kids developed similar symptoms that we find in children. The animals were more socially restricted. They did not interact with the other animals within the cage. They had repetitive behavior. So by all means, these animals demonstrated the same behavior that we find in kids with autism spectrum disorder. Now, these results are really profound, right? If you think about it, because all we've done is taken the gut microbiome from these two different groups of children and transferred them into these mice, and yet the mice who got the gut microbiome from the autism spectrum disorder had symptoms, behavioral symptoms that mimicked what we find in these kids. Now, this is telling us that the bacteria is having a direct role in causing these symptoms, which is an amazing finding because this can potentially suggest that by changing the gut microbiome in these children, we may be able to reverse the symptoms that we find. So then they asked, well, what was the difference between these two bacterial species? Were they secreting stuff that were different? So for that, they did massive screening, and in fact, what they found was two compounds that these bacteria were secreting that was different between the two groups. The group that got the typically developing microbiome had higher levels of 5-aminovilic acid and taurine, whereas the ones who were getting the gut microbiome from the autism spectrum disorder have lower levels of these two compounds. Now, what's exciting about these compounds is that these two compounds in the brain are involved in GABA signaling. GABA signaling is the neurotransmitter involved in inhibitory signaling in the brain. And this is a fascinating finding because one of the most well-established theories as to what causes autism's behavior is that kids with autism generally have lower inhibition in their prefrontal cortex. So without GABA signaling, the brain is on hyperexcitation and there's less inhibition. So for the researchers to pick up these two different metabolites that these bacteria are secreting and that these two metabolites are directly affecting GABA signaling, this tells us that the link is really, really clear, right? So then what they did was they asked, well, is it possible then to inject these two compounds into the mice and potentially reverse the symptoms? And that's exactly what they did. They took the 5-AV and taurine and injected into the animals that had the autism spectrum-like behavior. And guess what happened? The symptoms improved. The animals became more social, their repetitive behavior decreased, and they went back to looking like the animals that we found when they received the gut microbiome from the typically developing children. Now, this is an amazing finding because this suggests that the gut microbiome alterations are potentially one of the causes of the behavioral changes we see within these kids. Now, I want to make a caveat here, and that caveat is that we're not saying that autism is caused by bacterial alterations, but it could be one of the reasons. Essentially, what the paper demonstrated is that kids with autism spectrum disorder have profound changes within their gut microbiome. And again, the microbiome is all the bacterial content within our GI tract, our gastrointestinal tract. And that these bacteria are lacking specific species, which in turn are not able to produce 5-AV and taurine, right? So the lack of bacteria diversity that we see and the content that we see within the kids with autism spectrum disorder results in decreased secretion of 5-AV and taurine. And as a consequence, the brain doesn't become as inhibited, and therefore it leads to the behavioral changes that we observe within these kids. So this opens up a whole new avenue of treating these kids and being able to alter their behavior in a productive way just by changing the gut microbiome or giving them the metabolites that they're lacking, in this case the 5-AV and taurine. Now, once again, I really want to iterate that autism spectrum disorder is a heterogeneous disease, and there are multiple causes of that: genetics, environment, development. What we're saying with this paper is that now there's an additional potential cause, which is the gut microbiome. While scientists and researchers and doctors are working on figuring out how to fix the genetic causes or the environmental causes, this research result proposes that we might have another step or another alternative avenue in the meantime to help treat these kids by changing their gut microbiome. So there's two things we could do. We could either change the gut microbiome through fecal transplantation, or provide the kids injections with the metabolites that they're missing. Of this paper is that the gut microbiome brain interaction is once again proven to be very, very crucial. And as we begin to understand more and more about the gut microbiome, we will be able to better treat the kids and the neurological diseases that are caused by the gut microbiome alterations. So in the future, we will hopefully be able to figure out more of these interactions and have better therapeutic treatment options, not only for autism spectrum disorder, but for all kinds of diseases in the brain that have the gut microbiome as its core in terms of one of its causes. So for those of you who are interested in reading the primary paper, I have posted the reference on top, so feel free to read that. And if you have, like always, if you have any questions, please feel free to leave a comment below, and I'll be able to answer it with the best of my abilities. And finally, please don't forget to subscribe and follow SciTalks 2.0 on Facebook, on YouTube, and now on Instagram. With that, I want to thank you all, and hopefully you've enjoyed this presentation.